Well, next we have an exciting panel coming up on financial services. And it was interesting, Laura and I, the action group and Jones Day jointly hosted a summit about almost 2 years ago now in Jones Day. And to see what had come out of that summit is absolutely incredible, because I remember talking to Laura about this concept of addressing the financial institutions and have several sectors there. And we actually serve on the Knoble's committee as well, and to see the amazing work that they have done has just been incredible in the short period of time. And we have such an amazing panel here, and thanks Jones Day for leading the way, and Laura, thank you for moderating this panel. I can't wait to hear what you're going to do and the success in the short period of time that all of you all have created.
Thanks so much, Dave. And it's my really terrific honor to introduce everybody to this financial services panel. And one of the issues, of course, is why financial services. And I think Val touched on that in his comments, as did other speakers. This is a financial crime. It is done for profit, and it is a strong profit motivator. And there are always people who will want to exploit other people for money, and they will do it for money unless and until they are stopped. And so following the money, the ability to use financial services to identify and to interdict trafficking is absolutely critical. And to that end, we are really, really blessed to have 4 experts who are leading the way in that space. And I'm hoping they come up on the screen momentarily. Good. Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We read in a lot of the work that is done, and John and Val talked about this, about the importance of working across sectors, about working with government, with NGOs, with the private sector, all working in a coordinated way to attack these problems. And the panel that we have here is really an illustration of the power of that collaboration. And before we get started, I know many of you out there are involved in the financial services field. Many of you are not, and you may be wondering, what do financial services really have to do with human trafficking? So we thought we would start with just a few minutes of the role that the financial system plays in the global human trafficking challenges. And I've asked each panelist to introduce themselves, because the specific work they do is really germane to this idea of how organizations come together and how people from different spheres come together. So I've asked them to do their own introductions as part of it. And if I could call on Barry, if you would mind just kind of introducing yourself first, but then orient our audience on how financial services plays a role in global human trafficking.
Yes, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Dave, and thanks to Rotary for the introduction and for inviting me to speak here today. So I've spent about 25 years of my career in the financial industry, either as chief counsel to global anti-money laundering programs, or as chief compliance officer at large multinational financial institutions. I've also been an assistant district attorney here in New York County. And I first became involved in the fight against human trafficking about 10 years ago, when I realized that it is a phenomenon that victimizes more than 40 million people around the world. And it's a phenomenon where the world's worst people are profiting from the world's most vulnerable. Let me just quickly explain the difference between my 40 million figure and a figure of 24.9 million that you may have heard earlier this morning. The difference relates to forced marriages. Typically, young women, in some cases, they're 10 and 11 years old. They are coerced into forced marriages. They have no freedom of movement. Typical attributes of trafficking statutes, and certainly a violation of their human rights under applicable treaties. So that difference of about 16 million is explained by child marriages and coerced marriages. Some years ago, I was involved in the development and implementation of the banking industry's first quantitative model We called it the financial footprint of human trafficking, and it identified transactional and account and customer traits that were indicative of possible sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And we used this model to generate investigative leads, which we then shared with law enforcement because we believed that helping law enforcement identify the traffickers' assets was the best way that we could hurt the traffickers and make it more difficult for them to conduct their business. We weren't legislators, we weren't social workers, but we worked in a bank, and that's where the money was. And as a starting point, and you've heard a few references to this already, it's important to understand that the crime of human trafficking, which generates at least 150 billion a year, that's US dollars, is a crime that is entirely about greed. Unlike other crimes which may be committed for revenge or to make a political statement or for blackmail, human trafficking is all about the money. The global average cost to buy a human being for forced labor or sex trafficking is estimated to be $90. That's an extraordinary statement. And I heard a trafficker say once, I think it was actually in a Homeland Security training video, he was being interviewed after having been prosecuted and convicted. He was comparing the business of drug trafficking to human trafficking. And he said that human trafficking is a much better business model for the bad guys, because unlike drug trafficking, where the drugs are used up in one shot, he could sell the girls over and over again. Just an extraordinary, cold, blunt statement about how dark this crime is. But I've been actually encouraged by the heightened awareness that I've seen recently across many sectors to help eradicate it. And my comments today will be focused on how the financial sector has been doing that. For those of you who are not persuaded by the moral imperative to end slavery, if you're driven purely by the economics of the issue, you should know that human trafficking is economically inefficient. It is a significant drag on global economies and on capital markets. It depresses innovation, it fuels corruption, and it fuels illicit financial flows. I saw one estimate recently of the annual cost to the government in the UK per victim of £330,000, and a total annually between 3.3 billion and 4.3 billion pounds. Those are costs involved with law enforcement, medical and social services, lost tax revenues, etc. And interestingly, the IMF has recently estimated that developing countries that would eliminate child forced marriages would see an annual average increase of over 1% in their GDP. These are extraordinary numbers. Laura mentioned to me earlier, and she mentioned it in her intro, that we have many different business sectors represented in our audience today, and they're all stakeholders in one way or another in the fight against modern slavery and human trafficking. We have manufacturing and textile businesses where there may be trafficked labor in the supply chains. We have people from the hospitality and travel industries whose products and services are utilized by traffickers. We have attendees from pharmaceutical and healthcare industries, from not-for-profits, from NGOs, and various government agencies who deal with important policy and legislative issues in their attempts to address the problem. But the financial sector is a uniquely situated stakeholder because the financial sector, investment banking, asset management, institutional lending, international project finance and development loans. The financial sector moves global markets, and the financial sector drives decision-making by sovereign governments. So I've been asked to speak today from the perspective of someone who has held senior positions in the financial sector and who has created and led anti-trafficking initiatives in that sector, and also as someone who has been a prosecutor. So I'll be speaking about using financial data and financial records to initiate and strengthening trafficking prosecutions and to disrupt and dismantle the trafficking businesses. Back to you, Laura.
Great, thank you, Barry. So that's a little bit of the private sector side. On the government side, we heard before from healthcare that they are one of the more heavily regulated industries in the world. Financial services also is, and the government has a huge role to play in financial services. We're really blessed to have with us today Angie Salazar, who is actually becoming the cornerstone of many of the different departments of the government in their approach to human trafficking. So Angie, can you talk to us a little bit about your role with the center and its role in the government's response, and how you see the government and the private sector working together on these issues in the financial services sector's fight against human trafficking?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Dave. Thank you to Rotary and all the participants today who are joining. All the remarks that prior panelists have shared are right in line with what we're trying to do at the Center for Countering Human Trafficking. So just a little bit about me. My name's Angie Salazar. I've been with Homeland Security Investigations for almost 18 years now, and have been working on human trafficking investigations for the better part of my career. And I was really excited and honored when I was asked by our leadership to come to headquarters and head up this new Center for Countering Human Trafficking, which was established on October 20th. And the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security committed 16 of the DHS agencies to co-locate at the center, all with the goal of combating human trafficking. Our mission statement is to serve at the forefront of the Department of Homeland Security's unified global effort to counter human trafficking, including both sex trafficking and forced labor, through innovative law enforcement programs, education, and victim advocacy. So the goal of the center is to be operational, and by that I mean support ongoing human trafficking investigations. And we really are doing, I like to say it's 3 different parts of human trafficking. There's sex trafficking occurring in the United States and abroad. There's forced labor happening in the United States that we're investigating. And also we are investigating products that are entering the United States supply chain that were produced abroad using forced labor. And you've heard a lot about that this morning. But we're really working and engaging the field and all of the components who are now at the center. CBP Trade, we're working closely with them. You heard about the withhold release orders that were done on some of the PPE equipment that was coming in from Malaysia. So we are then taking that information and building it out into an investigation. And as far as public-private partnerships, so the center is a way to break down the silos between the different Department of Homeland Security agencies. Everyone knows how bureaucratic the government can be and how we end up setting up in silos, and we often don't communicate real time. And so the center is a way for within the department to start doing that. But more importantly, what we've been trying to do, and we've worked with Knoble, and we're working with many stakeholders, Jones Day, and really breaking down the silos between the operational efforts to combat trafficking while working with private sector to engage on challenges that you're facing while working with the government, but also to harness what best practices you've identified and find a way to implement those into government processes, whether it's to make survivor benefits available more easily, or to make the process to apply that for them more easily. But when it comes to financial and being on this panel, it's key for us to follow the money. You've heard it over and over again. This is a crime that's committed for money. And while oftentimes the human trafficking cases that we're encountering are not as sophisticated as some of the other criminal organizations like drug trafficking, where there's a clear pyramid scheme, we don't see that in trafficking. But more often than not, it's banking industry, financial industry, through their reporting of suspicious activity or other reporting that they provide law enforcement. That's the intelligence that as law enforcement, we often use to fill the gaps on building out these organizations. And a little bit later, I'll share with you an example of that. Thank you, Laura.
Great, thank you so much, Angie. We're going to stay with government for a second and turn it over to Theresa Forbes. When a lot of us in the private sector think about these issues, we think about FinCEN and Treasury. And so, Theresa, do you want to share with us some of the approaches that you are bringing to this sector? And please do a little intro of yourself to start.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you again for having me here. I'm Theresa Forbes, and I am at the U.S. Department of Treasury, and I am our policy advisor for human rights and corruption. It also covers human trafficking. As you know, human trafficking is not only a financial crime, it's also related to corruption, and it's a human rights issue. I became involved in countering human trafficking movement when I was 15 years old. I learned at that time that Atlanta was actually the largest metropolitan area in the world with slaves. It was completely horrifying to me, especially because that was only 2 hours away from me. So that's how I got involved in this movement. And I started at Treasury really because I knew that Treasury had some really great, unique tools to be able to combat human trafficking. As everyone said before me, human trafficking is a financially motivated and profit-driven crime. So therefore, it would make sense that the illicit finance of human trafficking and the follow money approach must be incorporated into broader efforts to combat human trafficking. You would think that Treasury was involved then in US government efforts all along. However, that wasn't really always the case. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that Treasury became officially involved in what's called the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. And since then, we've done a lot. And I just want to share a little bit about how our approach is to combating human trafficking. Last year, in our national strategy for combating terrorism and other illicit finance, we identified at Treasury that money laundering linked to human trafficking was actually one of the most significant illicit finance threats facing the United States. That illicit financial activity that human trafficking generates includes, for example, payments associated with the transport of victims, other logistics like hotels or plane tickets, the collection of proceeds generated by the exploitation of trafficking victims, the sale of goods produced through their exploitation, the movement of those proceeds, and as well as the bribery and corrupt dealings to facilitate human trafficking. So the movement of these funds generated by human trafficking can constitute money laundering. And at Treasury, we have a whole office that's looking at anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing. And so that's how we got involved in these efforts. And what we're doing is we're utilizing that 4P approach to combat human trafficking: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. We use kind of the prevention piece that was mentioned earlier. A lot of the multilateral development banks are doing projects in other countries that has to be financed. The Department of Treasury is working with those development banks to ensure that there are anti-trafficking provisions within all their projects to try to mitigate any type of trafficking risks. We also look at protection. Protection as in identifying potential victims of human trafficking, as well as identifying the perpetrators. We can identify that through the suspicious activity reports and that financial intelligence that's provided to us by the financial industry, as well as prosecution. And prosecution, we think of criminal prosecutions of human trafficking. It's not just that, it's also prosecuting money laundering. It's also looking at other enforcement tools. As was mentioned earlier, withhold release orders are an amazing enforcement tool. We have sanctions as well at Treasury. Treasury, we also have enforcement authorities over financial institutions because they have an obligation, a regulatory obligation to report suspicious activity to money laundering. And as human trafficking is a predicate offense to money laundering, financial institutions have that role and must play that role and are an important partner in that, which then brings me to partnership. To combat human trafficking more effectively, financial institutions are really encouraged to develop public-private partnerships with government, anti-trafficking NGOs, and survivor leaders to inform their programs, whether that's their anti-money laundering programs, their training programs, developing risk indicators for identifying customers that could be potential human trafficking victims or perpetrators. We also believe partnerships are so incredibly important with survivors of human trafficking. It's crucial that their voices are incorporated in all the work that we do, whether that's private sector, government, even within civil society. And it can also enhance the ability of anti-money laundering professionals to detect human trafficking transactions. We've seen a lot of financial institutions partnering with countering human trafficking nonprofits, survivors, and law enforcement with expertise in this crime to help understand some of the nuances of trafficking operations, evolutions in trafficking activity, to help them develop this up-to-date and refined monitoring and identification programs. And those partnerships are critically important in doing so. We've also seen a significant number of money laundering cases in the United States utilize the Patriot Act, which Section 314B, which is a special mechanism that actually allows financial institutions to share customer and transaction information with each other. Those are a couple of examples of how partnerships are so important in the financial crime space. And we've also seen, as someone mentioned earlier, breaking down these silos. It's so important for us to break down these silos in government, for us within the government to work together, for Treasury to work with Homeland Security, Department of Justice, Department of State, but also to break down those silos between those who are looking at human trafficking and those who are specializing in financial crimes. And then even breaking down silos within financial institutions. We've seen where some financial institutions have created internal working groups where representatives across the organization are collaborating cross-organization, whether that's in their ESG groups or their client onboarding groups. We're looking at anti-money laundering groups, all of those fraud, where they're really working together to help identify and mitigate human trafficking risks. They're helping law enforcement disrupt human trafficking operations and creating training and internal programs to help bring awareness to those issues. So just 1 second while I load up a couple of slides just to kind of show you a little bit more about Treasury tools that we have. And these tools are really for broad, looking at all illicit finance crimes and risks. But these tools are so important that we actually apply them to human rights and corruption issues like human trafficking. So this is just to show you, we have pressure tools, we have diagnostic tools, as well as preventative tools at Treasury. And all of those tools need to be harnessed with the power of the rest of the US government and our partners in the public and private sector to be able to combat human trafficking. One of the ways also that we work with partnerships is we started about 2 years ago. It's called the Partnership to Combat Human Rights Abuse and Corruption event. That's a public-private partnership where Treasury is leading and bringing together NGOs, civil society members from across the globe, US government partners, and really the financial institutions to talk about these issues and to share information, to share those indicators, to share typologies, to share best practices and information sharing, to really showcase how NGOs are sharing information with the financial sector and how the financial sector is using NGOs to kind of help them be able to provide context around maybe some of these illicit transactions. Financial institutions are great at really identifying sometimes this is an illicit activity, this illicit transaction, but they really need that context to help them understand that this can be potentially tied to a human trafficking situation. Those partnerships are critically important. Also, this past year, we really wanted to emphasize that partnerships were so important, not only to go after those who are facilitating and profiting from human trafficking and modern day slavery, but also how can we use Treasury tools to really help support those who have been impacted by human trafficking. So we had a whole panel on that actually, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's going to be critically important. And I think where we need to go in the future is really looking towards that, is not only following the money approach to stop the trafficking activity, but using that approach to really, and economic tools to really help prevent some of these vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking situations. We've seen Polaris has a report, where they talked about that many victims turn to traffickers due to sustained unemployment, unpaid debt, desperation to provide for themselves and their children, and that's only been exacerbated by the pandemic. So it's critically important not only that we use these financial tools to go after the bad guys, to follow the money, but to really help support those who have been impacted by human trafficking and also try to help prevent it. There's so many ways that we can do that. So that's something I look forward to continuing to work on it and hope that the community can come together, not only on the financial tools to detect and to disrupt, but also to help prevent. And that's something that we've seen with other partnerships, like with the FAST initiative. You know, they have a blueprint which talks about some of these things, like issues like providing microloans to help vulnerable populations, things like that that can be done as well. So it's critically important. One of the other things that we partnered with in doing, this was a requirement that was from Congress for the Department of Treasury and State to work together to develop a report on anti-money laundering efforts to counter human trafficking. And so we consulted with financial institutions as well as NGOs and survivors on taking kind of a look at what is the US government doing, what are financial institutions doing, but how can we improve those recommendations? And it really talks about how financial institutions play such a critical role in this, not only to help identify transactions at the transactional level, the teller level as well, and helping them with that. It's critically important. And some of the recommendations out of that report, you know, we're working on, but it's so important for us to have partnerships to be able to implement what we're trying to do, to be able to help combat human trafficking. One of the critical pieces that this report talks about is training that needs to happen at financial institutions, and some best practices that are going on in recommendations. One of the biggest ones is to include survivor voices in that training, but to also train and tailor that training to the different types of financial businesses and industries. As was mentioned earlier, human trafficking intersects with so many different industries. And so it's important to understand the different indicators for that. As well as indicators will need to be different depending on the type of financial institution it is, whether it's commercial banking or corporate banking, as opposed to personal banking or community. Many people don't know that financial institutions is not just your typical bank that you go to or depository institution. The definition of financial institution is very broad. It includes money service businesses, so those that use like Western Union and PayPal. But money service businesses is a broad definition in and of itself. That also includes money exchangers and virtual asset service providers. So when we're looking at virtual assets, those are all also regulated and have a reporting requirement and a role to play in combating human trafficking. The casino industry is part of the financial industry. Also dealers in precious metal, stones, and jewels, which all have different touch points with human trafficking. So it's so important that when we talk about the financial industry, we understand how broad the financial industry is and how important it is that all of them are partners in combating human trafficking. Also, trainings, a recommendation from this report was that training should also include the survivor leader community to also discuss not just to look at the transactional or teller level, but how and when to intervene, how and when to determine whether there might be a third party that has control over the victim, and whether forced criminality exists. So it's critically important that these trainings include that type of input. And it's really important to also include survivors and many of them, you know, are consulting and do this. The federal government has a program with a survivor network that gets paid for their services. They're providing critical services to us to be able to help consult us in our programmings and what we're doing. And it's so important. And that helps not be able to continue to drive human trafficking even further, and not exploit someone's labor. And so I think we need to lead by example and do things like that. Another area where we've done that is with the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking. It was the government's first action plan, and it has over 64 action items on what the US government needs to do to be able to combat human trafficking. And it's broken down into the 3 Ps and partnerships sprinkled all throughout it. This action plan is really important because it talks about how we need to continue and do more of incorporating this follow the money approach, financial crimes, seeking restitution. And the follow money approach is so important. To be able to make victims whole again, we need to be able to identify, trace, and seize assets of traffickers to be able to then seek restitution to help make the victims whole again. There's a big focus as well in this report on the need to be able to do more on forced labor, information sharing, and public-private partnerships. One of the other things that's critically important, as I mentioned earlier, is the use of financial tools to assist victims. They've always been harmed financially by human traffickers, and we need to be able to provide financial support services. As a government, we need to ensure that we're seeking restitution and also helping, and the private sector is involved in this, and helping repair things such as poor credit, bankruptcies, outstanding debts and collections, and fraudulent purchases in their name. And also the need for helping victims to be able to get identification documents, which is an issue that many of them have when they're in a trafficking situation. Their trafficker has their identity document, and they need that to be able to even empower themselves to open up a bank account or to get a loan. So those things are critically important. And they're critically important for us to be able to take this whole financial, economic kind of sector approach, is to not just look at utilizing our tools to go after the bad guys, but again, to be able to help support victims. One of the other things, and Barry talked about this a little bit earlier, was developing these financial indicators. That was an effort that was started many years ago, and it's being continued, and it as it should be. Those indicators are changing, and they're constantly changing. So it's important that we update those. So last year, Treasury took on an effort to be able to update what are those financial indicators on human trafficking. This is all publicly available information. And so you can see these indicators and red flags are really broken down to help at the teller level, kind of behavioral type indicators, and then transactional indicators, as well as identifying something that's been new with the suspicious activity reports that financial institutions file, is that there's now a checkbox to be able to check human trafficking. So previously, it was a lot harder for law enforcement that was using these reports to identify which ones may or may not be indicative of human trafficking. So now there's that added checkbox where financial institutions can kind of check, we think this might be potentially related to human trafficking, which was also important. And one of the other important things when it comes to reporting suspicious activity that we wanted the banks to know and the financial institutions is to report on the perpetrator and not the victim. In many cases, traffickers will use the victim to open up a bank account or to open up a company that's used to launder money and proceeds from trafficking and other criminal endeavors. Those are in victims' names, and not to report on the victim, but the perpetrator themselves, who could be controlling that account, even though it's not in their name. One of the other things when it comes to supporting survivors of human trafficking, as I mentioned, traffickers will use shell companies or legitimate companies to open up a business that's then used to launder the proceeds, making the company now illegitimate. And even when a trafficker has been put in jail and is now being prosecuted for their crimes, the victim is still left with all of this. And the victim then has to repair their own name. And then they're left with an IRS tax bill on this company. And so that's one thing at Treasury we're working on as well, is to be able to help victims, to get them to be able to work with the IRS and be able to help kind of clear their names of this debt that does not belong to them. Those are some other ways that Treasury is involved in these efforts. And I'll just take a pause there because I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other new efforts we're also undertaking to help support victims, but appreciate everyone's attention and look forward to the discussion further. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Theresa. You know, one reason that we were particularly thrilled to have both Angie and Theresa involved in this is because many times when we talk about the government, it's an it, right? It's a monolithic thing, but in reality, it is human beings who care passionately about these issues and are both capable and willing to have an intelligent discussion with all other people who have a will to participate in a meaningful way to combat trafficking. So I hope you see that and understand that this idea of collaboration is not just empty words. These are real people who are really serious about engaging in that way. So we're particularly glad to have them here. Before I introduce you to Ian, two things that we're not going to address on this panel, but are issues that we should at least mention to orient people to the financial services sector is what I'll call brick and mortar teller opportunities. Just as the healthcare sector will see activity in real time in their emergency rooms, so too often people who are tellers will see real-time activity in their banks or around their money machines. And so there's a whole separate level of training that a number of people on this call are happy to do for financial institutions and your on the ground people about the red flags and how to identify what you're looking at, and to do, really what Matt described before is to have that moment where you pick up the phone and you actually save a human life. And so those are other things that we don't have time to talk about here, but are very much a part of this topic for human trafficking. Another one is banking survivors. So if you are with a financial institution and you would like to help a survivor open a bank account, but they have no criminal record because since they were 12 years old, they have been victimized by human trafficking who basically took over their identity and treated them as a slave. And they're now in their early 20s. And for 10 years, they have no financial history that you can rely on. How can you as a financial institution nevertheless help that survivor from a banking standpoint? So that's an entirely different segment. If you have any questions on that, many people here can help answer those, but also aspects of financial services and human trafficking. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Ian Mitchell. You have heard many of our speakers refer to the Knoble and the really transformative things that the Knoble is doing in this human trafficking space. Ian Mitchell is actually the founder of that organization. And so we're really, really blessed to have him here and to have the work that he has driven forward in the world to now be an important part of what animates all of us. So with that, Ian.
Laura, I can't say thank you enough to you and Jones Day. Barry, you're tremendous. You always have been. And it's just a pleasure to have you on the board, and just thrilled what Treasury and Homeland are doing. I got to tell you, so many have gone before us at the Knoble. We're the new ones here in the fight, and it's an honor and a blessing to be a part of it. As Laura said, my name's Ian Mitchell. I lead, by day, I lead the fraud practice for PwC. I've been fighting fraud for over 20 years across over 30 countries. Been fighting bad guys, stopping identity theft and account takeovers and all the things that these bad actors have been fighting and been causing problems for customers of financial institutions. And just a real quick overview of why the Knoble. 6 years ago, I did an early retirement. I was blessed to be able to just go and say, I'm going to do something different. In fact, I grew out a beard and was focused on writing music. And it was funny, I met somebody that you all met, a guy named Matt Friedman, which I know he was speaking early, the Mekong Club. And I met him down in Atlanta at a happenstance coffee. And Matt started telling me about big data and using anomaly detection to look for patterns of human trafficking, which honestly, I knew nothing about. And it was in that moment that I started realizing over the next 3 weeks that maybe I've been looking at fighting financial crimes only half the battle. I've only been paying attention to half the fight. And so I thought very hard about entering back into the financial crime space and maybe doing it differently on the second half. And so that's what I did. In early 2019, we started the Knoble. The Knoble is the Knoble with a K. Truly what we are is a network of financial crimes and financial services and fintech professionals coming together to basically say enough is enough. To come together and say, not on our watch, our vulnerable population is going to get taken advantage of in the financial services industry. Vulnerable populations, as we define it, it includes human trafficking, it includes scam victims where bad actors are going after elders and youth. It includes online exploitation of children, anything that basically doesn't fall under the traditional definition of trying to protect somebody for financial services. I strongly believe, we strongly believe, that financial services, while we've done a tremendous amount, and Barry and so many have been doing this for years, I will tell you it hasn't happened at scale and it needs to be done differently. And I think financial services has truly been a missing piece. There are hundreds of thousands of professionals that are fighting financial crimes every day across banks worldwide, fighting fraud, fighting AML, money laundering, fighting cyber now. they're showing up every day to basically fight back. And so at the Knoble, we believe that if we can get that army together, if we can awaken, equip, and unite, we can bring them. We believe that we can actually make this a game-changing part of the equation, that we can be, because we have so much data, so much technology. Just look at the world of fighting fraud. We've been using machine learning for decades. We strongly believe that bringing the network of financial crimes, fintech, and financial services professionals together, we can change the equation. You know, we also believe that creating a network of data and information sharing, you've heard that as a theme. Truly, financial services have been sharing information in safe ways that have protected privacy to fight financial crimes for a long time. We believe that we can rethink the way we share information. And I think that, you know, just this has been interesting for me, and I'm going to turn it over because I know we have a lot to cover. And Laura, I can't say enough that you know, as we've all talked about, we need to think about this equation, this problem differently, and we are better equipped more now than ever. But I think when I think of the Knoble and the financial services network, I think that we have the opportunity to awaken purpose in a lot of people across the banking industry, across financial services, to engage in something bigger than just filing a SAR or showing up every day for work. I did that for over 20 years. I think there's actually meaning behind this. And if we can engage both intellectually, engage technology, and engage the people behind these missions, I think we have an opportunity to really change the way that things like human trafficking are being fought today. We're better positioned now than ever. COVID and stimulus has caused a rampant issue. I know we're all seeing this in the news around how bad actors are attacking vulnerable populations. There's no reason that if we can't come together with public and private, and even just private and private and unify that approach, I truly don't believe that there's anything that can stop us. Definitely, we have smarter people, better technology, and better data. So anyway, that's the foundation of the Knoble, and it really has been a blessing and a reawakening of my own personal career and so many people that have been involved in the Knoble, because there is so much we can do. Thank you to everybody that's on the phone from financial services on this. I think truly is something that we all need to get our head around and unite and really challenge the way that we've been doing this historically. And people like Barry have had ideas for a long time, and it's about time we kind of come together and start implementing them. So anyway, Laura, thank you for, again, an honor to be on this panel. And I look forward to sharing just some other concepts in a little bit.
Great, thanks so much, Ian. Let me ask sort of a broad question, and Angie, just as a heads up, I'm gonna start with you here. In January, Congress passed what's known as the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, AMLA, and a related Corporate Transparency Act. And these are the most significant changes to AML that have been done, at least since I've been practicing the last couple of decades. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those new acts and how you think that new law, effective in January, might impact human trafficking issues specifically. And if I could ask you just at the beginning to just give a 2-second layperson explanation of what money laundering is. We use money laundering and AML as a term of art, but for people who may not be as familiar with it, if you could just give a quick layperson's definition to start, that'd be great.
Sure. So as law enforcement, we continuously look at criminal organizations and the crimes they're committing. The proceeds that they gain from that is what we go after. And many organizations are excellent at cleaning that money, finding a way to push it through a legitimate business or a legitimate banking industry to make that money look clean, like it was earned legitimately. That's what we call money laundering. And that's the real challenge with human trafficking. And I think that's the real exciting part of the two new laws and legislation. I think as the regulations to follow those laws get in place, it will really help us. And I'll share, because criminal organizations, human traffickers, use legitimate banking industry, whether they're using postal money orders that are proceeds from human trafficking, or putting money in banks, or buying homes with the proceeds from trafficking. All of those are ways that human trafficking organizations reinvest human trafficking proceeds into our economy. And our job is not only to rescue the victims who are in these situations, but to go after the traffickers' money. We've learned jail time doesn't often deter. We've learned that deporting people who are illegally doesn't deter the crime, but we have learned that taking their money from the criminal activity does help. And more importantly, with the restitution laws for victims, it's our only way to try and make these victims whole again for the time that they've been held against their will in these slavery situations. I'll share with you a case we had out of Dallas. It was a brothel industry that used various shell companies to launder their illicit proceeds. They used U.S. Postal. They bought, luxury vehicles, multiple properties around the country. But at the heart of their business was luring and recruiting women online through Facebook, through subpoenas and investigative methods. We found over 20,000 ads that they had put in Backpage and Craigslist, recruiting females who could do massage, and then ultimately were exploited and forced into sex trafficking. The investigation revealed that over a period of 6 months, they earned over $2.1 million. This was 41 victims that were identified through the case, and the sex acts were being billed at about $100 to $150. So you can imagine the life of the victims and how they were living it. Much of the investigation, we relied heavily on the folks that Ian mentioned, the anti-money laundering personnel at the banks, the tellers who were reporting the suspicious activity, and filling in a lot of the gaps that we didn't know who all was involved. Originally, the brothel recruited women who were here in the United States but had come from South Korea and who were engaged in prostitution before coming here. And then the traffickers made a pact with the documented gang members in Dallas, disciple gang members, who were bringing in their own sex trafficking victims, many of which were minors. The force that was used was beatings. Some of the victims were cut with box cutters when they wouldn't meet their minimum daily quota of $1,000. One of the minor victims, her head was, didn't meet her quota, and so the trafficker beat her and ended up hitting her head against the toilet so hard that he broke the toilet with her head. And I can just say that identifying all the pieces, in the end, we charged 19 co-conspirators throughout Texas and other states, but we wouldn't have been able to make all of the links to all of the co-conspirators had we not partnered with financial industry, had the case agents not reached out to the actual writer of those suspicious activity reports from the banks to truly understand what it was that they were seeing, and understand all the different links that that were a part of those financial transactions. We rescued the victims. These cases take a long time, but they stayed with it. And ultimately, the main trafficker, the one I described as being the violent one, ended up getting sentenced to life in prison. So I think I share this with you so you understand, one, the work of the center. This is our bread and butter, right? We want to make sure that, there's many organizations that we plan on partnering with, private sector and government. But at the heart of it is identifying these cases that come in as, maybe a public report. This one came into the local law enforcement in Dallas as, there's a lot of ads in the paper, maybe we should look into it. And so we did. And what the center will do is help the agents in the field or the law enforcement in the field to build it out by following the money, by looking at all of the different aspects and tools that you've heard mentioned today. and really building it out with the goal of, one, rescuing the victims, but two, identifying the patterns and trends that are being used in real time and sharing them with law enforcement and the public to truly increase prevention, by letting people know what to look out for and sharing with the public what are the traffickers doing today and what patterns and trends are they moving to, what methods of operation are they using to lure victims. The minors in this case, the trafficker was just sending messages to thousands of minors online and social media telling them how beautiful they were, until some of them agreed to meet with him. And then that set them on this path of exploitation. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Angie, and thank you for making that really real and concrete for all of us. Ian, let me throw it over to you. What do you see as the most sort of hopeful coming attractions? Where do you think that real change can be made, either through AmLaw or through some of the partnerships that you described before?
Thanks, Laura. I will tell you, just the financial services has to do better. We have to do a better job of helping our law enforcement partners. We need to equip them with more information, better information, and more real time. I have a credit card here, and I'm just going to try to make it real here. If you think about what happens every time us as consumers swipe our card, the amount of data that's shared, the amount of information that's shared, the risk scoring that happens, and how fast that information is actually processed, that processors and such, that's an infrastructure that exists today. When I think about the way we communicate with our law enforcement partners in the SAR construct, when I think about the way banks communicate with each other and share information, I feel like at times that maybe we've designed this process, it's a couple decades old. It's not been modernized. And so I think of just Elon Musk and the way that he's looking at building more, different batteries for the coming kind of wave, and they're redesigning the way the battery. I think we need to do the same thing in financial services. We need to build a better battery and just start looking at how we actually share information and empower and equip our law enforcement partners in better real time. For those that know the SAR process, it is highly paper intensive. It's highly investigator intensive. Different quality of SARs happen by different quality of investigators, both within banks and across banks, how they get their information. There's a lot of analytics that they have to do on their end to make it usable. I think there's a way when we start thinking about leveraging the ecosystem and the core infrastructure on how we operate in financial services. I believe strongly that there's a way that we can redesign it, thinking just like the credit card example, thinking about the end, the new end in mind, uniting banks and law enforcement in a way that does preserve security and privacy and all the things we're concerned about. We have a roadmap to do that. We're doing it in financial crimes today. So I think if we, and I'm in this conversation a lot with other members of law enforcement, I do think we have a roadmap to get there and maybe design this with the end in mind of better information sharing, faster information sharing, getting better information to law enforcement like Angie's team. It is important though that the foundations exist to allow us to do that. I think FinCEN's guidance recently has opened doors, the way that we can now potentially look at sharing information. I think that's been tremendous. Last year was a great year for encouraging partnerships and sharing information. But I do think we have some other hurdles that we need to think about and solve related to privacy and security and such. But candidly, I think we've figured it out for other aspects of financial crimes. And I have no doubt that there are smart people in the financial services industry, in law enforcement, in government, in NGOs coming together. We can work together to redesign this battery, redesign this process so that we can be better positioned to win this fight and others. So hopefully that example made sense. And I am encouraged. I'll tell you, I'm more encouraged now than I've ever been because we actually have the technology, data, and tools better than we ever have. So anyway, thank you again. And I think our job is to help make organizations like Angie's law enforcement's job easier.
Great, thank you, Ian. To that end, I'm going to turn this over to Barry and talk about ways that records from financial services industries can actually help make cases. And I'm just going to say really quickly, I'm watching, we have a lot of questions to cover. So we have about 10 minutes left of our actual panel time. So with apologies to Barry and Theresa, I'm going to ask you to try and keep us, to that time with the remaining comments, and then I'm going to take some questions. Barry?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to abbreviate some of these, but let me first, in the interest of time, just say thanks for mentioning the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, those survivor bank accounts. That is an initiative that I created in partnership with Polaris when I was a commissioner on the Liechtenstein initiative. And it's very gratifying to be able to say that more than 700 survivors have been reintegrated into mainstream financial services by the opening of bank accounts. What that means is it has reduced their risk of being re-victimized. So we won't have time to go into the initiative today, but if you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. So I'm going to go very quickly here. It's good that we don't have simultaneous interpretation because they would start throwing things at me. But in the interest of time, I should share my view that unequivocally using financial data and financial records to prosecute trafficking cases is an effective weapon in the fight to end trafficking. It's been effective in identifying victims and perpetrators, in proving coercion, which is a required element in a criminal charge, in corroborating witness testimony or supporting allegations when a witness doesn't recall specific dates or transactions, and in serving as the basis for asset forfeitures. It's something Angie just mentioned, that is seizing the properties, the expensive homes and cars and boats and planes and other assets of the traffickers. Using financial data and financial records also provides opportunities to prosecute traffickers for other crimes often related to the trafficking that can sometimes be prosecuted without the testimony of victims who may be afraid to testify. There are serious crimes such as money laundering, tax evasion, bank fraud, kidnapping, extortion, identity theft, and immigration fraud. They can all be pursued, and they all form the basis for asset forfeitures as well. And the property that's subject to asset forfeiture is quite extensive. It includes real property, houses, restaurants, stores, hotels, farms, office parks. It includes tangible personal property, cash, jewelry, art, boats, airplanes, and cars. Intangible personal property like professional licenses, medical, pharmacy, liquor licenses, as well as the bank and investment accounts, and virtual currency and website domain names. So you can see that this asset forfeiture route is a powerful disruptor of the trafficker's business model. Now, we don't have time to, I don't have time to describe the regulatory regime in any detail. Theresa started talking about that, about how regulated financial institutions are required to report transactions where the institution suspects that the proceeds are criminally derived. And she also talked about something quite interesting, which is that it's not just banks that are included, it's insurance companies, casinos, securities broker dealers, crypto exchanges, and the like. These reports are called suspicious activity reports, SARs, and the government can use, and the government does use, as Angie mentioned, the narratives in these SARs to highlight the trafficker's motives and to demonstrate the trafficker's knowledge of the initial illegal activity and consciousness of guilt. These SARs can also identify co-conspirators by showing where the money goes, and can also identify additional victims. And some of you who've been involved in these cases in the criminal justice system, you know that witnesses may be reluctant to testify. Sometimes they disappear because of a realistic threat of violence against them or family members. And these reports and the underlying financial records can be used to pursue these other criminal charges that may not require testimony. So for example, prosecutors can bring a case against a trafficker for tax evasion or structuring or money laundering, where the trafficker's tax returns report minimal income and assets, yet the financial records refute those tax returns by illustrating a lavish lifestyle. Those financial records are compelling evidence for the jury. So from the perspective of financial monitoring and prosecuting the traffickers, I came up with a top 10 list, but I'm not going to do all 10. in the interest of time, but let me offer a few for your consideration. One is make greater use of asset forfeiture laws. We've heard about that. If it requires legislative or regulatory changes, they should be evaluated and discussed. And you should know, actually, that there's a difference in the US between the civil path and the criminal path. The Jeffrey Epstein case is still proceeding along the civil path. It does not require an underlying conviction in his case. The government is still going after the townhouse and the plane and the island in the Caribbean and all of the other assets, even without a conviction, which of course is impossible to get. That is different from a criminal asset forfeiture. Two, consider expanding the ability of using forfeited assets to provide victim services. Three, expand the scope of prosecution to facilitators. So people or businesses that assist, enable, aid, or financially benefit from the trafficking. And this would include, for example, prosecuting people and businesses who provide false documentation or identification with the knowledge that it will be used to further the trafficking. Four, deals with cryptocurrency. The regulations around the world are inconsistent. That creates opportunities to maintain anonymity and evade monitoring. There's a need for global minimum standards. And the US and Theresa's office in particular has taken a lead role here, and other countries should follow. Five, this one has always interested me because it's not my area of expertise. Always consider using expert witnesses in your case. Psychologists, medical professionals, social workers, victim advocates. You want to have them involved to explain to the judge and the jury why victims might recant their testimony, why they might minimize or change their story, why they might omit or withhold information, and might be reluctant to testify against the traffickers. And it's important to use the experts to explain unfamiliar language and slang regarding the sex trade, especially in electronic communications and text messages. Sometimes most of the communications between a trafficker and the victim are limited to text messages, and the content of those messages can be used to demonstrate to the jury that the traffickers controlled all aspects of the victim's life, which is being used, you're using that to rebut the defense that the relationship was consensual. So for example, you show texts in which the victim asks permission to eat, asks permission to sleep, to work, to take bathroom breaks, etc. I'm going to skip 6, I'm going to skip 7. On number 8, it really reinforces some of the comments from our keynote address. Encourage financial institutions to conduct a periodic risk assessment to evaluate their exposure to human trafficking. Banks are accustomed to doing this for money laundering and corruption and sanctions, and for doing it for other risks like credit risk and currency fluctuation risk and operational risk. But few banks evaluate the risk of human traffickers utilizing their accounts and products. I think that doing this, I'm sure that doing this would lead to the identification of additional controls, which in turn would lead to more suspicious activity reports being filed, which in turn would mean that more actionable intelligence is being provided to law enforcement to initiate and pursue cases. And there are industries, the extractive industries, oil and minerals, they typically have many layers of subcontractors in their supply chain. And on the corporate and commercial banking side, there really is an insufficient level of risk assessment going on right now. And that's an area that should be improved. The one last thing I will say about risk assessments is that there is a huge gap, which is that very few institutions and very few governments have made the connection between human trafficking and terror financing. There are published reports, for example, that the Islamic State has conducted in-person slave auctions in areas that they control and online slave auctions. And Boko Haram has used kidnapping and enslavement to support their fighters. And the national risk assessments don't generally consider human trafficking as a risk for terror funding. And I would suggest that governments look into that. Lastly, I would talk about capacity building through training and information sharing. And of course, information sharing is foundational to the Knoble's work and what Ian spoke about. I think I would advocate that governments should evaluate ways to bring what I call and what others have called trauma-informed responses to justice-involved victims. We should build on lessons learned in the drug treatment courts, domestic violence courts, mental health courts, as others have said earlier. This should include examining better ways to disposition arrests for prostitution, especially instances involving a minor, and better ways to address the unique needs of these vulnerable populations. Governments should also share emerging typologies, especially in the areas of dark web investigations and hidden websites where victims are advertised for sale. And I'm optimistic that we'll do more of that through the Knoble's efforts. And I'm optimistic that the recent congressional bill that was passed will provide for more of that type of cutting edge information sharing. Back to you, Laura. You're on mute.
Sorry, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can, Laura.
Okay. So thank you for that. I apologize for a minor technical difficulty at this end. I think, Theresa, we have one question from Ghana, as a matter of fact. Can we get access to your slides? And the answer is yes. So for everybody, we have actually had a couple of questions on that. The slides will be made available to everybody. And we're down, I apologize. Part of my job is to play street cop here. So if you could, Theresa, maybe talk to us a little bit about what you see as coming directions from your perspective. Maybe take about 3 minutes if I could keep you to that, and then we'll do a couple of questions and do wrap up.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to highlight too, with the new Anti-Money Laundering Act that was passed, it was critically important because, as I mentioned earlier, traffickers are exploiting gaps in our regulatory regimes to allow companies to be formed without company ownership information. So this legislation was really needed to help mandate the disclosure of beneficial ownership of these legal entities. Another challenge that we've seen is that survivors lacked identity documents to help get them access to the financial system. So we at Treasury have been leading efforts to support called a risk-based approach to the responsible use of digital identity solutions, which can help survivors of human trafficking obtain access to the financial system. Also, innovative anti-money laundering compliance solutions like using AI and big data and advanced analytics for transaction monitoring and suspicious activity reporting and identification will be potentially play a role in changing the way human trafficking is addressed both by the government and private sector, which can help strengthen our ability to detect not only identity-based fraud in transactions, but also for traffickers that are exploiting personal identity information of human trafficking victims. Also, innovative digital financial services can help enable governments and NGOs as well to more securely and remotely send assistance over to victims and provide financial services, including like online microlending, which may help with individuals and households from becoming victims in the first place or being re-victimized. So I think we'll see a lot of shifts now with this new legislation in some of these areas as well, which I think is really important. And to be able to, with this new legislation, to be creative and think how we can all partner together to be able to share information, break down silos, and be able to take action on that information, which is the most critical, I think, important piece is us as partners. We can share all the information, have all this great data and technology solutions, but if we're not taking action on it and if we're not doing anything with it, we're not really making a difference. I think that's going to be critically important. One last thing I'll just share really quickly is kind of my parting thoughts is, even if you're not in the financial services sector, there are so many ways you can get involved with human trafficking, as you saw from the other panels. There's Polaris's On-Ramps report, where it talks about how human trafficking intersects with all kinds of industries. So you can really learn information from there. But you can also take action as just being you. It was mentioned earlier as a customer of someone who buys products, ensuring that the products you're buying are not made with forced labor. Looking into companies that can securely look at their supply chains, like chocolate bars. There's a couple of companies that, are using their power there to eradicate slavery and chocolate supply chains, which is a huge issue. The clothes that we wear, we're all wearing clothes today, making sure that we're looking at that, and that the cotton is not made from concentration camps and forced labor camps in China. There's so many ways we can take action, not only in our professional lives, but also our personal lives. There's a whole list of them on the slides that will be sent around, so I will just quickly wrap up there. But we all need to take action, every single one of us, and when we take action together, it's even more impactful. So thank you.
Beautifully said, Theresa. Thank you so much. We've had a number of questions on the Nicholas Kristof article that many of you may have seen in the New York Times about Pornhub and online. We've had a couple of questions about crypto and online. And maybe if I could ask Angie, maybe to just offer a couple of thoughts about how financial services entities can be a partner in the fight against that kind of situation, and also maybe offer some last thoughts. And then I'm going to turn to Barry and Ian really quickly for last thoughts so we can round up on time.
I'll quickly say that we're familiar with the Kristof article. And in fact, we reach out to many investigative journalists, as everyone has mentioned, the forced labor supply chain cases, and how difficult it is to look at foreign countries and get their get information on forced labor activity that's happening abroad. And we are not ignorant to the fact that much information is gathered by investigative journalism. So we harness them, we work with them, and we were happy to see that article. So that answers that question. Was there a second one? Sorry.
Any last minute thoughts that you want to share as your last words to the assembled sectors and audience?
I just want to thank everyone for joining, for being interested in this topic, and thank Rotary, Jones Day, everyone, the panelists, for being a part of it. This is a real challenge to find this hidden crime. I think oftentimes, Hollywood makes these movies on these cases that that's often misleading. These crimes happen, in basements. They're not, victims aren't willing to come forward. I saw someone mention or ask about why victims go back to the situation. It's our job as law enforcement to really put ourselves in the shoes of the victims, or and understand what their reality was during this exploitation. And that's why victims go back. They're brainwashed, they're made to feel worthless. There's a lot of shame involved in this crime. And oftentimes they don't feel worthy of becoming independent and end up going back to these situations. So I just want to thank everyone. I left the Blue Campaign website for all attendees. That is the center's outreach campaign to combat trafficking. We produce a lot of material through them, and it gives all sectors an opportunity to get involved and fight this crime. Thank you.
Great. Barry?
Sure, I'll be very quick. I've been working in the compliance and financial crimes area for a very long time, and it works. We can't solve all of the world's problems in a day, but the anti-trafficking efforts, where there is much more awareness now, have led to victim rescues and successful prosecutions in cases that I've seen, and meaningful disruptions of the trafficker's business. So I would say that in my experience, it's really very gratifying to be able to say that that I feel like I've done well by doing good. And anybody else out there considering working in the financial sector in a compliance function or investigative function, you can do well by doing good, and I would encourage it.
Great. Thank you, Barry. Ian, last thoughts for our panel.
Yeah, my last thoughts. First of all, thank you to the panelists on there. I just love, you're all an inspiration. Laura, thank you so much for what you and Jones Day continues to do, and thank you to the Rotary. My just parting thoughts are get involved. There's probably people in your organizations that want to get involved. I think this problem's big enough that we need to do it together. We can solve this together. I think that's the way to do it. I think you're hearing that from everybody here. So thank you for already just investing your time on this session. And if interested in the Knoble and what we're doing around red flags and all kinds of small initiatives, Knoble spelled with a K, Knoble, theknoble.com. But otherwise, I just got to tell you, just thank you for spending the time with us. Truly, this has been life-changing for me, and I know for a lot of folks, just to find, again, that purpose and being a part of something that there's this much need. So anyway, thank you to Rotary. Thank you, Laura. Appreciate it.
And thank you all. Thank you to our panelists, and a special thank you, if I could, to our government panelists. You do this work 24/7 every single day, and my guess is you don't get thanked a lot or enough. And so from those of us who are out here in the field, please know how much we appreciate what you do, and thank you for what you do.